The core principle of consequentialism is very simple and clear. The morally right action is the action that maximizes the overall utility of the community. This principle has been criticized by many scholars. At the moment, there are two main criticisms. One is injustice. This principle allows the interests of the minority to be sacrificed for the benefit of the majority, which is unfair to the minority. The other one is demandingness. In order to maximize the overall utility, individuals are obligated to donate the majority of their income to help the poor, which is too demanding. These two criticisms seem irrefutable, but in fact they are wrong. The reason is that critics do not properly understand the meaning of maximizing overall utility. How to maximize overall utility? The overall utility can be maximized only if everyone in the community maximizes his or her own utility. As long as one person does not maximize his or her own utility, the overall utility cannot be maximized. Therefore, in order to maximize the overall utility, each person's priority goal is to maximize his or her own utility. It dictates that each of us has to be self-interested. Self-interest means that people have to compete with each other, that is, competition for resources. In order to compete for resources, mankind has fought countless wars over the past few thousand years. However, in order to survive, in addition to competition, humans also have to cooperate. Cooperation means that people have to share resources. Competition and cooperation are completely opposite. Without a powerful institution to coordinate, it is impossible for humans to compete and cooperate at the same time. Therefore, humanity has to need a powerful institution. We all know that this institution is the government. As a powerful institution, the government serves two main purposes. First, when people or groups compete for the same resource, the government has to adjudicate disputes to avoid competition getting out of control. Having the power to adjudicate means that the government has the power to allocate resources. Second, the government has to promote cooperation, even forcing everyone to cooperate at critical times. For example, when a foreign enemy invades, the government must be able to force people to enlist in the army in order to protect the homeland. Since the government has the power to allocate resources, how should the government allocate resources? Obviously, the aim of the government should be to increase the overall utility. Once the allocation of resources is optimal, the overall utility is maximized. How can a society optimize the allocation of resources? Theoretically, it is simple: allocate resources based on the individual's ability. The person with the most ability should be allocated the most resources because he can create the greatest utility for society. And the person with the least ability should be allocated the least resources. Since it is based on ability, what humans should do is to design a system that can test the ability of individuals. Then the government will allocate resources based on the individual's ability. However, before the 18th century, this system had not yet been invented, and the power to allocate resources was in the hands of a single person or a group of people. One person is dictatorship, and a group of people is feudalism. Such a government cannot be called a government at all, but a dynasty of individual. However, there is a serious flaw if the power to allocate resources is in the hands of people. The pursuit of self-interest by individuals dictates that people have to be selfish. Since people are selfish, it is impossible for them to allocate resources fairly when they have gained the power to allocate resources. They will inevitably use the power to illegally seize the legitimate resources of others, which is unfair competition. Unfair competition will inevitably severely distort the allocation of resources. Once the allocation of resources is severely distorted, the overall utility will drop to a very low level. However, there are some unrealistic fantasists who believe that not everyone is selfish. If we can find selfless people and give them the power to allocate resources, there will be no unfair allocation. Now we all know that this approach is not going to work. Even if the allocator is selfless, it is impossible for him to know the ability of everyone. If he can't know everyone's ability, he won't be able to allocate resources based on people's ability. Eventually, there will be a lot of mismatches and serious mismatches. Therefore, even if the individual subjectively wants to allocate fairly, in practice, it is impossible for him to achieve it, which in fact will inevitably lead to unfair competition. It is clear that in order to prevent unfair competition, no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources. If we cannot rely on people, what do we rely on to allocate resources for us? In the 18th century, mankind invented a system that is democracy. In a democracy, no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources. This way it ensures that everyone is equal. Fair competition can only be achieved under the premise of equality. Fair competition means that everyone can only compete for resources by their own ability rather than power. Here we can see a significant advantage of democracy. As long as no one is permitted to have the power to allocate resources, resources can be automatically allocated based on ability. Since it's an automatic allocation, we no longer need to rely on anyone to allocate resources for us. However, equality cannot completely eliminate unfair competition. There are still some disadvantages that can lead to unfair competition. One of these disadvantages is monopoly. Another disadvantage is education. We know that education can greatly improve a person's ability. However, because of poverty, many people cannot afford to go to school, and their abilities cannot be improved. Therefore, in order to promote a greater degree of fair competition, the government must take measures to minimize various disadvantages, such as preventing monopolies or giving as many people as possible access to education. That's my argument for consequentialism. However, probably many people think that my argument does not really respond to the criticisms of consequentialism. In the next part, I will prove that both criticisms of consequentialism are wrong. The first criticism is injustice. Let's look at an example. Tom is standing on a bridge above a track. A trolley is hurtling down the track towards 5 people. If Tom wants to save the 5 people, the only way is to drop something very heavy in front of the trolley. And Tom notices a fat man standing next to him, who is heavy enough to stop the trolley. Tom can push the fat man onto the track, which will kill him, but save the 5 people. Should Tom push the fat man onto the track? Critics point out that from a consequentialist point of view, in order to maximize the overall utility, Tom should push the fat man off the bridge. Do consequentialists really think Tom should push the fat man off the bridge? No. I have argued earlier that in order to maximize the overall utility, no one should be permitted to have the power to allocate resources. The resources include not only wealth, fame, opportunity, and power, but also, in a broad sense, human life and organ, marriage, and so on. If anyone thinks that Tom should kill the innocent fat man in order to save 5 people, it means that Tom has the power to allocate lives. Obviously, this action is antithetical to the principle of consequentialism. The same goes for marriage. If a person's marriage partner is decided by his parents, it means that the parents have the power to allocate the marriage partner of their child. This action is also antithetical to the principle of consequentialism. However, this is not to say that under no circumstances should individuals be permitted to have the power to allocate resources. In fact, in some cases, the law permits individuals to have the power to allocate resources. One of them is bankruptcy. If a company files for bankruptcy, the business owner will not have to repay the debts to the creditors, which undoubtedly violates the rights of the creditors. In fact, there are some people who use this system to commit fraudulent bankruptcies. Obviously, if individual rights are inviolable, bankruptcy is not permitted. However, bankruptcy is now permitted in almost all countries. Why is bankruptcy permitted? It can only be explained by consequentialism. In order to assess the consequences of bankruptcy, we must list all the advantages and disadvantages and then weigh the pros and cons. What are the advantages of bankruptcy? If bankruptcy is not permitted, most people will not dare to take risks, which will greatly reduce the overall utility. Do the advantages of bankruptcy outweigh the disadvantages? We can find the answer from the facts. Now bankruptcy is permitted in almost all countries. It is clear that the advantages of bankruptcy outweigh the disadvantages. The second criticism is demandingness. Let's look at two examples. Example 1. If Tom is a consequentialist, he is obligated to donate as much money as possible to help the poor in order to increase the overall utility. It will result in Tom not having enough money to live the life he wants to live. Obviously, it is too much to ask of Tom. Example 2. Suppose a natural catastrophe leaves Tom's mother and 10,000 people in a desperate situation. If Tom saves his mother, he will not have time to save those 10,000 people, and those 10,000 people will die. If Tom saves 10,000 people, he won't have time to save his mother, and his mother will die. Which side should Tom save? Critics point out that from a consequentialist point of view, Tom should save the 10,000 people. Are the criticism in these two examples correct? Wrong. As I argued earlier, the government exists for two main purposes: to prevent unfair competition and to promote cooperation. In terms of preventing unfair competition, in the vast majority of cases, all people rely on legal compulsion to prevent unfair competition. However, when it comes to promoting cooperation, in the vast majority of cases, the government cannot legislate to force everyone to cooperate. It has to respect the will of individuals. We know that promoting cooperation is just as important as preventing unfair competition. Why doesn't the government legislate to force everyone to cooperate? Because once the government introduces such laws, the government can deprive individuals of their rights at any time in the name of promoting cooperation. For example, the government can force Tom to donate most of his wealth to help the poor, or force Tom to save 10,000 people instead of saving his own mother. Further, in order to save the 5 people on the track, the fat man on the bridge doesn't need Tom to push him. He has to jump off himself, or he breaks the law. Obviously, once such laws are implemented, everyone will inevitably fall into fear, and the country will inevitably collapse very quickly. Therefore, in order to avoid collapse, in terms of promoting cooperation, the government cannot force everyone to cooperate. It has to respect the will of individuals. Even if Tom doesn't donate money, even if Tom doesn't save those 10,000 people, he won't be punished in any way. Of course, Tom's donation or saving 10,000 people does promote cooperation and thus increase overall utility. So these actions are always encouraged by the government and society. But if Tom doesn't want to do them, he'll rarely be blamed. At least the government can't force him to do them. However, this is not to say that under no circumstances can the government force everyone to cooperate. In some cases, the government has to force everyone to cooperate. Most commonly, in the event of a foreign invasion, the government has the power to force citizens to enlist in the military. There is also another very common form of forced cooperation in today's society: levying high taxes on the rich and then using the money to help or subsidize the poor. It is a clear violation of the rights of the rich. In order to justify this violation, Rawls proposed the theory of moral desert. I don't think Rawls's argument is convincing. If we can justify one violation, we can justify any violations. If no violation can be justified, why are certain violations still permitted? It can only be explained by consequentialism. In order to assess the consequences of an action, we must list all the advantages and disadvantages and then weigh the pros and cons. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using the rich's money to help the poor? Most people may be very clear about the disadvantages, but when it comes to the advantages, most people are probably not so clear. The only advantage that many people can think of is the maintenance of social stability. If the poor who have no income are not helped, they may be forced to break the law in order to survive. It will inevitably lead to social instability, which will seriously reduce the overall utility of society. Therefore, in order to maintain social stability, the government must provide relief to the poor. However, many people think this advantage is negative. Are there any positive advantages to the system? Yes, there are two, and these two advantages are more important. First, in what case do most people dare to take risks, dare to innovate, and dare to pursue their dreams? In the case that their basic survival needs are guaranteed. So in countries with well-established welfare system, young people are full of energy, dare to take risks, and dare to try new things. Such a society would enable citizens to make the most of their ability. Conversely, in underdeveloped countries, because the government provides little relief to the poor and everyone's survival needs cannot be guaranteed, there are very few people who dare to take risks. What most young people pursue are the most secure careers rather than their own dreams. If young people do not dare to take risks, there will be no innovation in such a country. The whole society will be bleak, and there will be no hope in sight. Second, we know that the consumption of the rich is very high. But no matter how high the consumption of the rich is, it is impossible for one rich person to buy 10,000 cars or 10,000 houses. In fact, the consumption of the rich accounts for only a small part of their income, and most of their income is saved and not used for consumption. It is obviously very detrimental to social consumption. If a part of the money that the rich do not use for consumption is transferred to the poor will basically spend all the money they get because they have low or no income. As a result, social consumption will increase. An increase in social consumption will lead to an increase in production. We know that most of the people who are engaged in investment and production in general are rich people. As a result, the incomes of the rich will also increase. Obviously, it is an upward spiral, which increases the overall utility and increases the utility of the poor. At the same time, it does not reduce the utility of the rich too much. However, it is not to say that the higher the tax on the rich, the better. If taxes on the rich are too high, it will weaken the incentives for the rich to create wealth. If the rich are unwilling to create wealth, the total wealth of society will decrease, and the money transferred to the poor will also decrease. It is a downward spiral, which reduces overall utility. Obviously, the tax rate is key. Too high or too low will reduce overall utility. Do the advantages of using the rich's money to help the poor outweigh the disadvantages? We can find the answer from the facts. In today's world, almost all countries with well-developed welfare system are developed countries. It is clear that the advantages of this system outweigh the disadvantages. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize again that individual rights are not absolutely inviolable. In other words, the government's protection of individual rights is not rigid, but slightly elastic. On the premise that everyone is equal, the government assesses every right of the individual. If the violation of a certain right increases the overall utility, the government will legislate to permit the violation. For example, it permits bankrupts not to repay the debts to creditors, or it uses the money of the rich to help the poor. Of course, the government has to try to draw the line very clearly and minimize ambiguity. For example, the expenditure of taxes and the criteria for taxation have to be very clear. Only by drawing the line very clearly can we prevent the government from imposing taxes indiscriminately. This elasticity makes consequentialism the only self-consistent and coherent theory. Other theories are generally divided into two types. The first is fragmented intuitionism, in which various fragments contradict each other. So intuitionism cannot be constituted into a complete theory. It is precisely because intuitionism cannot be constituted into a complete theory that many philosophers have tried to create theories that can accommodate intuitionism. Unfortunately, none of them have succeeded. These theories they have created are inelastic and can only conform to a part of intuition. Why are these theories inelastic? Because once they become elastic, they will inevitably turn to consequentialism. In order to prevent a turn to consequentialism, these theories have to remain rigid.